Do you ever think about God's timing? Welcome. We're taking another look into the life and message of Elisabeth Elliot. She called us to live to a higher standard, that we should not be satisfied with just a little empty religion in life as a shallow substitute for giving God our best. We'll continue hearing from family, friends, and others, all influenced by the life and message of Elisabeth Elliot. Hey, thank you for coming along today. You may remember we're in the midst of a series called Humble Things. Actually, we're at the last two in that 8-part series. Humble Things 7 and 8, God's Timing, and More Strange Ashes are programs for today. Also, we'll be hearing from Elisabeth Martin, one of the granddaughters of Elisabeth Elliot, and from Nancy, as she talks about the ministry of God's Word in her life as she listened to Elisabeth Elliot. That coming up later. Right now, think again about humble things. She said, "Lord, deliver me from the delusion of imagining that my desire is to serve you, when my real desire is the distinction of serving in some way that others admire." She asked the question, have we the humility to thank our Father for the gift of pain? Here's part 7 of Humble Things, God's Timing.
In my last talk, I told you one of those major blows to my faith that I experienced during my first year as a missionary. My informant, Don Macario, the man that was helping me with reducing the Colorado Indian language to writing, had been murdered. Some of you have heard the story of Jim Elliot, if you've been listening to these programs. I went through the book Through Gates of Splendor, which tells the story of 5 American missionaries that were killed in Ecuador, one of them being my husband, Jim Elliot. Then, in his biography, Shadow of the Almighty, I told you his life story. So if you heard those programs, then you know a little bit about how Jim and I got together. We had known each other in college, but when I was living in San Miguel, Jim was working way over on the other side of the Andes in the eastern jungle with a tribe called Quichuas. We were not at that point engaged. We had been in love for about 5 years, but Jim was still not sure whether God wanted him to remain single for the rest of his life, perhaps because of jungle work that needed single men. So one day, in January of 1953, I was working on the Colorado language in that big old barn of a house where we lived in the jungle clearing when I heard a horse galloping up to my door, and there was a knock on the door, and a friend from Santo Domingo handed me a telegram. The telegram was from Jim, asking me to meet him in Quito. Never did a girl's heart leap more joyously than at the thought that Jim actually wanted me to meet him in Quito. Surely this time, after all these years, he would have an answer from God. It wasn't as though I could jump in my car and drive to Quito, however. I had to wait until the next day, ride a horse about 4 hours, stay another night in Santo Domingo, and then at about 4 o'clock the following morning, get a place on a banana truck. That was the only kind of bus that there was available in those days. It was just those big old lumbering banana trucks that had a few seats up in the cab. I got myself a seat on one of those buses and took that grinding, excruciatingly slow trip up into the Andes to the city of Quito. I met Jim at the home of mutual friends. We greeted each other in a very controlled way in the presence of others. And then, finally, at long last, we were able to be alone in front of a fireplace. And that evening, Jim said, "Do you want to marry me?" Well, do I want to marry him? I could have said, "I thought you'd never ask." But he wasn't saying, "Will you marry me?" He was just saying, "Do you want to marry me?" And so I didn't say anything for a while. I sat there thinking, looking at the fire. And I thought of a lot of the things that he had said in the past about why he could not ask me to marry him. I thought of what he had written in my college yearbook about no man that warreth entangleth himself in the affairs of this life, and he intended to keep himself disentangled, including marriage, including being disentangled from marriage. I remembered his desire to be like the Apostle Paul, free to give himself to the work of the gospel without the hindrances of wife and children, and I knew that his father had prayed for this kind of life for Jim. I thought of an older missionary's warning that the Quechua work couldn't be done as it ought to be done, except by single men. But I loved him. I had loved him for a long time, and I had tried to keep that love in a tight rein, praying often in Amy Carmichael's words. And here's another one of those poems by Amy Carmichael that had become a part of the warp and woof of my spiritual life. Shall I pray thee change thy will, my Father, until it be according unto mine? But no, Lord, no, that never shall be. Rather, I pray thee, blend my human will with thine. I pray thee, hush the hurrying, eager longing. I pray thee, soothe the pangs of keen desire. See in my quiet places wishes thronging. Forbid them, Lord. Purge, though it be with fire. And work in me to will and do thy pleasure. Let all within me peaceful, reconciled, tarry content, my well-beloved's leisure. At last, even as a weaned child. So I asked Jim if he believed that God had given his permission for us to marry. He said he did. That was enough for me. But then he told me he thought it might be 5 years before we got married. Well, it had already been 5 years since we fell in love, and everything in me said, oh, no, 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 no. Please, Lord, don't let it be that long. Well, God in his mercy never suffers us to be tempted above that we are able. And it wasn't that long. But the next thing that happened was indeed a test of faith. We're talking about God's timing. God had kept us stretched out, as it were, like a rubber band over that period of 5 years of silence and separation and uncertainty and extended longing. Now we were engaged. Everything was going to work out wonderfully well. We were in Quito together, and we both went for routine medical checkups. The verdict came back from mine: you have tuberculosis. I couldn't believe my ears. I felt perfectly well, but the doctor said, no, there's an ominous spot on the x-ray. We're going to have to put you through a series of tests, and then we'll try it again next week. But in the meantime, we've got to treat you as though you have tuberculosis. My first thought was, there is no way that I will ever be able to marry Jim Elliot, because I would be nothing but an albatross around his neck. A sickly wife in pioneer jungle work? Never. Well, God is merciful, and a few days later, after I had undergone some rather painful, inconvenient tests, the doctor said, I don't know what happened, but there's no spot on your lungs anymore. Jim took it as a direct answer to prayer. He went back to his work in the eastern jungle with the Quichuas. I went back to San Miguel and the language work. Even though my informant Macario was dead, I had to continue attempting to reduce the language to writing. It was a much more difficult task without the help of Macario. There was nobody bilingual that could work with me. But in a hit-or-miss fashion, I was able to waylay an Indian here and there. I went to their houses. I pursued them in their plantations. I hailed them when they came past on their horses. And in one way and another, I filled up my little language notebooks. I began analyzing the language with charts and cards. I used many different informants, painted, greased, combed, perfumed. They were always very affable and hardly ever kept their promises. Oh, yes, I'll be here tomorrow. Yes, señorita, I'll give you 2 hours. Yes, I'll stay the night. Yes, you can come to my house. Yes, I'll be home. Well, they didn't come tomorrow. They didn't give me 2 hours. They weren't home when I got there. But in the mercy of God, the job was gradually, very slowly, very laboriously getting done. We filled up our time with treating the sick, keeping body and soul together, boiling water, trying to keep that fogon going, that fire in a sandbox, trying to keep the bats out of our hair and out of the bananas, generally doing things that people have to do in order to survive in the jungle, washing our clothes in the river, bathing in the river, and that sort of thing. We treated the sick, we delivered babies, we went to the fiestas, we gave out worm medicine, and there were many delays of many kinds. I had prayed that I would learn to tarry content my well-beloved's leisure. In other words, to wait peacefully and quietly for God's timing. Nearly a month went by after the fiesta, during which no mail came from Jim because of avalanches on the road to Santo Domingo. There was no gasoline either for our lamps, and we were running out of candles and kerosene. Dorothy and Doreen were both in Quito and couldn't get back or send any word to us. Finally, those who were commissioned to repair the road got around to repairing it, and trucks began to move. Co-workers came back with mail and supplies, and my reading in the Daily Light, that little book of scripture selections that I told you about, said this: I have seen the affliction of my people in Egypt, and I have heard their groaning, and have come down to deliver them. There failed not aught of any good thing which the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel. All came to pass, and it shall be said in that day, Lo, this is our God. We have waited for him, and he will save us. It seemed that we were doing an awful lot of waiting in San Miguel, but I was waiting until I could get out of there and get to where I could study Quechua, because when Jim proposed to me, he had said, I won't marry you until you learn Quechua. You can be sure I had powerful motivation for learning Quechua. And so, by mid-June of that year, I had developed an alphabet for the Tzafiki language. Tzafiki is the name that the Colorados give to their own language. And I was then free to leave my materials with my colleagues Doreen and Dorothy, having coached them in the use of these materials, and I was free to move then into the eastern jungle. God's timing is never exactly like ours. He's either way behind us or way ahead of us, it seems, or we should put it the other way around. We're way behind him or running way ahead.
The next to the last in our series on humble things, that was God's timing. One of the things I'd like to do during our time together is not portray Elisabeth as somehow perfect, because none of us is, but to help you get a sense of what she was like behind the scenes. Who better than to talk to one of her family members? Elisabeth Martin is one of her granddaughters, and she talks about some of the early days of her life and the influence her grandmother had on her.
I think it was often when we went to her house, if we saw the spear, for instance, on her wall and asked about it, or the first time we visited her house, she wanted to show us all the artifacts, because they were really like museum artifacts in her house. This is the headdress made out of peacock feathers. There was one of the Warani headdresses that were made from peacock feathers. She wanted to show us this spear and talk about it, that this spear was a gift from one of the killers. And I remember just thinking, one of the killers. It did not register with me at all what she was saying. So I think she realized that we as children didn't have an appreciation for what a big deal it was that they gave her this spear and said, this is for you, but not to kill a person with. We would never kill people anymore. And that should have hit me pretty hard, but I didn't appreciate the treasure that was to her, that the glory of the gospel had helped her to not just accept that as a gift, but to realize the depth of change that had happened in those people. That they had used these spears to actually kill people, and one of them could have been used on one of the husbands of those women. But it was on her wall. Yeah. So there were things that in her house she would love to share with us and talk about, but she wasn't constantly bringing up our grandfather, which I do find interesting. And I wonder if it was just because we had never met him and her own daughter had never had any memories of her father because she was so young when he died. So it was just an accepted thing that you'll meet him when you go to heaven.
One of the granddaughters of Elisabeth Elliot, that was Elisabeth Martin. Later on, we'll hear from a listener named Nancy, who will talk about how Elisabeth has had an impact in her life. Right now, let's consider the final part of our Humble Things series. This is called More Strange Ashes. Elisabeth said if we refuse to humble ourselves and be content with what God sends, what's the alternative? Rage, bitterness, misery. She said the world looks for happiness through self-assertion. The Christian knows that joy is found in self-abandonment.
I've been telling you the story of my first year on the mission field as a young missionary working in the western jungle of Ecuador with a small tribe of Indians called the Colorados. I've told you how my informant Macario was murdered and how a woman for whom we had been praying gave birth to a child and died in the process. These were two tough lessons. I want to tell you today about 3 vital lessons that every servant of God has got to come to terms with at some point. The first of these is that I am a servant. I am wholly at the disposal of somebody else. A servant is somebody who is not doing his own thing. He's doing somebody else's. A servant has no wishes. A servant has no personality. A servant has no input. And I can hear somebody out there saying, wait a minute. That sounds terrible. A servant of God has no personality. He has no wishes. He has no input. Well, in the sense in which we are only servants, that's true. And the sooner we learn that we are unprofitable servants, as Jesus clearly said, the more freed we will be to do the work of a servant. We have a personality, of course, which God has given us. God knows all about our desires. The psalmist said, all my desire is before thee. And as far as input goes, we're allowed to talk to God, aren't we? We can speak to him in prayer. We can speak to him as we speak to any friend. I talk to God a lot while I'm working, while I'm walking, while I'm riding on planes. But as a servant, I must remember primarily that I am at his disposal, that he's the one giving the orders, and that I am going to do his work in his way, in his time, and with his supply of grace. That is a vital lesson to learn. I am a servant. Secondly, my work is for him. It's not my work. It's his work. And I'm doing that work for him, for his glory. And the third thing is my master is the Lord of the universe. He is my master, but he is also the Lord of the universe. Simple lessons to understand, not necessarily easy lessons to learn. Number 1, I am a servant. Number 2, my work is for him. Number 3, my master is the Lord of the universe. And by way of illustration, I'm going to carry on with my story. Yesterday's talk was called These Strange Ashes, and today's talk is called More Strange Ashes. I told you that Jim had proposed to me and had said he wouldn't marry me until I learned Quechua. The only way that I could learn Quechua was to move over into the eastern jungle where Quechua was spoken. And so I had an invitation from a couple named Jerry and Carol Kahn, who lived in a place called Dos Rios. They invited me to come and stay with them and help with the work and learn Quechua. It was a Quechua-speaking area and only about 6 hours' walk from where Jim Elliot was living. By then, Jim was my fiancé. And so I moved to Dos Rios. They gave me a very pleasant room overlooking a great field of pasture and banana trees and orange trees toward the Mishawali River. And I used to look out across that river and think only 6 hours on the other side of that river is my beloved, Jim Elliot. But I had had my own ideas of my role among the Colorados and what God was supposed to do and what I was supposed to do. Well, I had thought I did pretty well what I was supposed to do, although it was interrupted by the death of Macario. It didn't really seem to me, quite honestly, that God had done what he was supposed to do. He wasn't really supposed to let Macario get killed, was he? Was that really a part of his plan? Well, yes, Lord, I know I'm your servant, but I wanted to define the terms. Well, yes, Lord, I know my work is for you, but I really wanted it to be my work. I wanted to be known as the apostle to the Colorados and maybe have my name on a missionary book someday or something like that. Well, God was still in the process of teaching me these 3 vital lessons. I was a long way from having mastered any one of them. I had not been working very long in Dos Rios when I had a letter from Doreen, one of my 2 English colleagues, who was still working with the Colorados. As I told you, I had reduced that language to writing. I had done just the very basic and elementary work, and had been coaching Doreen and Barbara in the use of these materials. They had not had linguistic training as I had, and so they needed some help. But I felt that they were going to be able to carry on from the foundation that I had laid. I had turned over all of my notebooks, all of my 3x5s, all of my charts, everything that went into the reducing to writing of that language to Doreen and Barbara. Doreen had that suitcase full of data on one of her trips to Quito. When you traveled in those banana trucks, they threw all the baggage up on the top with the bananas. And you never knew whether you were going to see your luggage again, but you really didn't have a choice. There was not an inch where you could put anything inside the cab. I had a letter from Doreen telling me that that suitcase had been stolen. The suitcase that contained my year's work, all the foundational linguistic work of the Colorado language. Remember that this was 1953. There were no tape recorders, at least not in the jungle, there weren't. There were no copies of anything. Lesson 3. Maruja's death in childbirth had been Lesson 1. Macario's death had been Lesson 2, or in a sense, the biggest lesson, maybe Lesson 1, because it was so devastating to the work that I was trying to do. And here was Lesson 3. In each of these cases, the great questions of life had come again to the fore. Once again, I had to come to terms with what it means to be a follower of one who was crucified. It always means a personal encounter with the cross, and the cross always entails loss. The great symbol of Christianity means sacrifice, and no one who calls himself a Christian can evade this stark fact. It's not by any means an easy thing to recognize within a given instance of personal loss, the opportunity it affords for participation in Christ's loss. When we're in the middle of things, we don't have a whole lot of perspective, do we? We ask ourselves, what can this possibly have to do with that? We're not really by nature inclined to think spiritually, are we? At least I'm not. I'm ready to assign almost any other explanation to things that happen. There is a certain reticence to infer that our little troubles could actually be vehicles to bring us to God. This ridiculous little thing that's happened to me, what has it got to do with the will of God? And we grin and bear it, knowing that they're simply the lot of ordinary human beings, and our memories are marvelously selective, and we forget about them and we cancel them out, and we thereby miss the lessons that we were supposed to have learned. Certainly I didn't think immediately of the loss of the language notes as God's way of breaking down my categories, but I certainly was dumbfounded to realize that all that work was down the drain. I was furious at whoever stole the suitcase and had undoubtedly discarded all of that paper. Certainly wasn't going to do any thief any good. Wouldn't have done anyone any good that was not linguistically oriented. I guess I wondered, too, whether the owner of the suitcase had perhaps been careless. Was Doreen really paying attention? But there wasn't anything to be done about that, no hope of recovery, and so that was the end of that. It was only gradually, over the months that followed, that I realized that nothing is finally lost. All the scriptural metaphors about the death of the seed, losing your life, the world's passing away, all these go on to something unspeakably better and more glorious. Maruja and Macario were dead. They were buried. I had a radio message from Jim telling me, and this was lesson number 4, that the entire station on which he had been working had just been washed down the Amazon in a flood. There's a little legend, I don't know the source of it, but it tells about Jesus walking one day with his disciples and telling them each to pick up a stone to carry for him. John, it is said, chose a large one, while Peter chose the smallest. Jesus led them to the top of a mountain and commanded that the stones be made bread. Each disciple, hungry and tired by this time, was allowed to eat the bread that he held in his hand. But of course Peter's was not sufficient to satisfy his hunger, so John gave him some of his. On another occasion, Jesus again asked the disciples to pick up a stone to carry, and this time, guess what? Peter chose the biggest one of all. But this time, instead of taking them up to the top of a mountain, Jesus took them to a river and told them to cast the stones into the water. They did so, and then waited for the miracle. Nothing happened. They looked at each other in bewilderment. They looked at Jesus. "For whom," said Jesus, "did you carry the stone?"
Humble Things, Part 8, the final in our series on that subject. It was called More Strange Ashes. Well, one of our fellow listeners, Nancy, had some thoughts about how the Lord has used Elisabeth in her life.
I am so blessed by the ministry of Elisabeth Elliot. I was a young mom. I'm already crying because I'm so touched by her ministry in my personal life. I had just had my firstborn son, and he was 6 months old when I came across that Elisabeth Elliot and Gateway to Joy was just beginning a ministry on the radio. I listened to those programs with such a hunger and such a heart to be taught. She was a spiritual mentor to me, a spiritual mother to me. And over the years, I absorbed her teaching for those years. I believe it was a decade she was on, and had 3 more children after that. I incorporated her quiet hour idea, and we always had it in the afternoons from 2 to 3. Her program came on, I believe it was at 2 o'clock or 2:15 to 2:30. And it gave me that opportunity to be able to really focus on her teaching while the children had their quiet hour in their rooms and read quietly. What a blessing she was to me. And I thought it was so precious how that when people, I know I'm not the only one, but when I would write to her, she would write personal letters back or type letters back. And how special that was. So I am grateful for your ministry still going on today. In fact, on our radio station, WDAC, in the evenings, I can still hear Elisabeth Elliot's program. Though I'm not raising children anymore, I'm now a grandma. I so enjoy listening, and just it brings back those warm memories, but I still can incorporate much of what she shares on her program. So thank you all so much for your ministry of carrying on the legacy of a woman who meant so much to me when I needed a spiritual mom. Thank you so much. God bless you.
Well, thank you, Nancy, for sharing that. A friend, maybe you'd like to share how the Lord has used the ministry of Elisabeth Elliot in your life. Well, then you can join us at elisabethelliot.org. Find the podcast section and then share a message. Go to elisabethelliot.org. Look for the podcast section, and with your phone, you can leave a message there where it says, share a message. More talks, devotionals, videos, and more at elisabethelliot.org. On behalf of the Elisabeth Elliot Foundation, in cooperation with the Bible Broadcasting Network, let me invite you to check out all the resources. But until next time, may God remind you each day, you are loved with an everlasting love, and underneath are the everlasting arms